Ethan Walker stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse, staring out at the sprawling city below. The rain poured relentlessly, creating a shimmering curtain over the concrete and steel labyrinth he called home. From the 43rd floor, the world felt distant, almost surreal, a painting rather than a reality. It was a view that most people would envy. Yet it brought him no joy. The penthouse itself was a masterpiece of modern design. Every corner spoke of wealth, custom-made Italian furniture, abstract paintings by renowned artists, and lighting fixtures that looked more like art installations than functional pieces. Yet, for all its opulence, the space felt cold and lifeless, as though the soul of the place had long since fled. It reflected Ethan perfectly, a man who had achieved everything society deemed valuable yet felt utterly empty. At 35, Ethan was the head of a successful tech empire. A self-made billionaire who had climbed to the top through sheer determination and ruthless ambition. He had everything money could buy: cars, luxury vacations, private jets, and the adoration, or fear, of those who worked under him. But what he didn't have was purpose. Each day felt like a mechanical process, a series of decisions and actions that no longer excited or challenged him. He sipped his bourbon, savoring the burn as it slid down his throat, and let out a heavy sigh. Somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered that he was missing something, something crucial. But Ethan had long since stopped listening to that voice, burying it under layers of distraction and denial. A sharp chime from the doorbell broke the silence, echoing through the vastness of the penthouse. Ethan frowned. He wasn't expecting visitors. He set his glass down on the marble counter and walked toward the door, his footsteps muffled by the plush Persian rug beneath him. When he opened it, he was met with a sight that caught him off guard. Standing there was a woman in her late 20s. Her dark hair tied back in a simple bun. She was dressed in the standard uniform of a housekeeper, black slacks and a crisp white blouse. But there was nothing ordinary about her demeanor. She stood with quiet confidence, her posture straight, her gaze steady. Unlike most people Ethan encountered, she didn't avert her eyes or look uncomfortable under his scrutiny. Instead, she met his gaze with calm composure, as though she had every right to be standing there. "Mr. Walker," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I'm Sophia Miller. I've been hired to work here." Her tone was neither deferential nor cold, just matter-of-fact. It was rare for anyone to speak to Ethan without a hint of nervousness or awe. People either revered him for his success or feared him for his power. Sophia seemed to do neither. Ethan studied her for a moment. She was attractive, though not in an ostentatious way. Her features were sharp but balanced, her eyes a deep brown that seemed to hold secrets she wasn't about to share. There was an elegance to her that transcended her simple attire, an aura that felt out of place in the role of a housekeeper. "I wasn't informed of this," Ethan said, his voice edged with the mild annoyance that often accompanied any disruption to his carefully managed life. "My apologies if it was unexpected," Sophia replied smoothly. "The agency said you required additional help. I was told to start today." Ethan's instinct was to send her away. He didn't like surprises, and he valued his privacy above almost everything else. But something about her presence made him pause. Perhaps it was the calm defiance in her gaze, or the way she seemed completely unaffected by the grandeur of the penthouse. Most people who stepped into his world were overwhelmed, their awe thinly veiled by polite words. Sophia, however, seemed unimpressed, as if wealth and luxury were irrelevant to her. "Fine," Ethan said finally, stepping aside to let her in. "Do what you're here to do." Sophia entered the penthouse. Her movements graceful and deliberate. She carried a small bag, which she set down by the door, and began to take in her surroundings. Her gaze was analytical, as though she were mentally cataloging the space. But there was no trace of judgment. "Your apartment is beautiful," she said. Her voice neutral, as though she were commenting on the weather. Ethan didn't reply. He wasn't sure why. But her lack of overt admiration unsettled him. Most people would have gushed over the artwork or the panoramic view, trying to ingratiate themselves. Sophia, however, seemed completely uninterested in impressing him. He watched as she walked further into the living room, her eyes briefly lingering on a sculpture near the fireplace. It was one of Ethan's favorites. A piece by a contemporary artist that symbolized chaos and order in perfect balance. Sophia didn't touch it. But her expression softened for a moment, as if she understood its meaning. Then the mask of professionalism returned, and she turned back to him. "Where would you like me to start?" she asked. "Wherever you see fit," Ethan replied, waving a hand dismissively. He wasn't used to giving detailed instructions. People typically knew what was expected of them without him having to say it. Sophia nodded and began her work, moving through the penthouse with quiet efficiency. Ethan tried to ignore her, retreating to his study to bury himself in emails and spreadsheets. But her presence lingered in his mind. There was something about her that he couldn't quite place. Something that set her apart from anyone else who had ever entered his orbit. Over the course of the afternoon, Ethan found himself watching her more than he cared to admit. She moved with a precision that was almost hypnotic. Her every action deliberate yet unhurried. There was a stillness to her that contrasted sharply with the frenetic energy of his world. By the time the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the city, Ethan realized he hadn't gotten any work done. He frowned, annoyed at himself for being so easily distracted. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that Sophia Miller was no ordinary housekeeper. She was a puzzle. And Ethan Walker had always been drawn to solving puzzles. That night, as he stood once again by the window, watching the city lights flicker in the rain, Ethan's thoughts drifted back to Sophia. Her calm confidence, her unshakable composure, they were qualities he hadn't encountered in years. For a man who thrived on control, it was both infuriating and intriguing to meet someone who seemed immune to his influence. Ethan didn't know it yet. But Sophia's arrival marked the beginning of a transformation he couldn't yet fathom. She wasn't just another employee. She was a force of change. One that would challenge everything Ethan thought he knew about himself and his world. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of cynicism and disillusionment, Ethan felt the faintest flicker of something he hadn't experienced in years: curiosity. Ethan Walker leaned against the cold marble counter of his penthouse kitchen, nursing a glass of bourbon as he absent-mindedly stared at the sleek clock mounted on the wall. The rhythmic ticking filled the otherwise silent space. It was late afternoon, and the rain outside had yet to ease. Thick droplets raced down the glass windows, blurring the view of the city below, a sprawling, endless network of roads and skyscrapers that felt as distant as another planet. The unexpected ring of the doorbell shattered his thoughts. Ethan frowned, setting his glass down with a soft clink. He wasn't expecting anyone. Visitors were a rarity in his life, and even more so without prior arrangement. He walked toward the door, his footsteps muffled by the lush Persian rug beneath him. A slight irritation simmered in his chest. An uninvited presence in his carefully controlled world was never welcome. When he opened the door, he was met with a sight that made him pause. Standing there was a woman in her late 20s. Her dark hair neatly tied back into a simple bun. She wore a crisp white blouse tucked into tailored black slacks. The uniform unmistakably marking her as a housekeeper. But it wasn't her attire that caught Ethan's attention, it was her presence. The woman stood with a quiet confidence that immediately set her apart. She didn't fidget or avoid his gaze, as most people did when faced with his scrutiny. Instead, her deep brown eyes met his directly, unwavering and calm. Her posture was straight, her shoulders squared, and her expression neutral, revealing neither deference nor discomfort. It was as if she belonged there, despite having never stepped foot in his home before. "Mr. Walker," she said, her voice steady and smooth, with just a hint of softness that prevented it from sounding mechanical. "I'm Sophia Miller. I've been hired to assist you." Ethan tilted his head slightly, studying her. There was no nervousness in her demeanor. No effort to appease him with polite smiles or unnecessary pleasantries. It was unusual. Most people who interacted with him either tried too hard to impress him or shrank under the weight of his reputation. Sophia, however, did neither. She simply stood there, waiting, unbothered by the silence stretching between them. "I wasn't informed of this," Ethan said. His tone clipped. He wasn't in the mood for surprises, especially not ones that involved strangers entering his space. "My apologies," Sophia replied, her expression remaining composed. "The agency assured me that the arrangements were in order. If this is an inconvenience, I can leave and follow up with them." The words were polite, but there was no hint of hesitation or subservience. She didn't fumble or backpedal, as Ethan might have expected. Instead, her gaze remained steady, her tone even. It was clear she was prepared to leave if necessary. But it was equally clear she wouldn't plead for a chance to stay. For a moment, Ethan considered dismissing her. His initial instinct was to shut the door and contact the agency later. But something made him pause. Perhaps it was her calm demeanor, or the way she seemed unaffected by the opulence surrounding her. Most people who stepped into his penthouse, whether contractors, employees, or even guests, couldn't hide their awe. They glanced at the sleek furniture, the priceless artwork, and the panoramic view with poorly disguised wonder. But Sophia didn't spare a glance for any of it. It was as if the luxury around her didn't matter. "Fine," Ethan said at last, stepping aside. "You're already here. You might as well come in." Sophia nodded once, a brief acknowledgement of his decision, and stepped into the penthouse. She carried a small bag, which she placed neatly by the door before taking a moment to survey the space. Her eyes moved methodically, but not with the wide-eyed curiosity Ethan had come to expect from newcomers. Instead, she seemed to be assessing the room, its layout, its details, with a quiet efficiency. "This is a beautiful home," she said after a moment, her tone neutral, as though she were stating a fact rather than offering a compliment. Ethan raised an eyebrow. There was no admiration in her voice, no attempt to flatter. It was a simple observation, delivered with the same detachment one might use to comment on the weather. "Where would you like me to start?" Sophia asked, turning her attention back to him. "Wherever you think it's needed," Ethan replied curtly. He wasn't used to giving instructions for tasks he considered beneath his involvement. People in his employ were expected to understand their roles without him having to explain them. Sophia nodded again and began her work, moving through the penthouse with quiet precision. Ethan watched her for a moment, unsure why he felt compelled to observe her at all. There was something deliberate about the way she moved, graceful yet purposeful. She seemed neither rushed nor idle. Her pace steady and unhurried. Shaking off his curiosity, Ethan returned to the kitchen, intending to refocus on the drink he'd abandoned. But even as he sipped his bourbon, his mind kept drifting back to her. It wasn't just her composure that intrigued him, it was the aura she carried. She felt out of place in his world, yet entirely at ease within it. Hours passed, and Ethan found himself crossing paths with Sophia more than once. Each time, he caught subtle details about her, the way her gaze briefly lingered on a sculpture by the fireplace. The way her hands moved with practiced precision as she adjusted a centerpiece on the dining table. She rarely spoke, only addressing him when necessary. And even then, her words were concise and devoid of any emotional undertones. It was unsettling, and fascinating. By the time evening fell, Ethan was no closer to understanding her than he had been that afternoon. She was polite but distant. Efficient but enigmatic. There was no attempt to ingratiate herself. No visible effort to earn his approval. She simply did her job. As though the opinions of her employer were irrelevant. As Sophia prepared to leave for the day, Ethan found himself standing near the door, waiting without fully understanding why. When she approached, she paused, her calm gaze meeting his once more. "Will you be returning tomorrow?" Ethan asked, the question coming out more abruptly than he'd intended. Sophia tilted her head slightly, as if surprised by the inquiry. "If you'd like me to," she said simply. Ethan hesitated. He wasn't sure what he wanted, only that the idea of not seeing her again felt oddly disconcerting. "Yes," he said finally. "Same time." Sophia nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips, though it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Good night, Mr. Walker." With that, she stepped out, leaving Ethan alone in the vastness of his penthouse. The rain continued to pour outside, the sound of water tapping against the windows filling the silence. Yet, for the first time in a long while, Ethan didn't feel entirely alone. There was a presence in his mind now. An inexplicable curiosity that refused to be ignored. He walked back to the window and stared out at the city. His thoughts consumed by the woman who had entered his life with such quiet authority. Sophia Miller was unlike anyone he had ever met. And Ethan Walker couldn't shake the feeling that her arrival was only the beginning of something far greater than he could yet comprehend. The days that followed Sophia's arrival were marked by an unusual tension within the walls of Ethan Walker's penthouse. It wasn't the kind of tension that came from conflict or chaos, rather. It was an undercurrent of quiet resistance. Like two opposing forces circling each other without ever colliding. Ethan found himself at the center of this silent standoff. Increasingly intrigued, and increasingly unsettled, by his new housekeeper. Sophia Miller had become a quiet fixture in his home. She moved through the penthouse with practiced ease. Cleaning, organizing, and tending to her duties with a precision that left no room for error. Yet, for all her efficiency, she remained an enigma. She rarely spoke unless spoken to. And when she did, her responses were concise, often neutral. Ethan couldn't recall a single instance where she seemed flustered or caught off guard. It was as though she operated on an entirely different wavelength. One he couldn't quite access. For a man like Ethan, who thrived on control and thrived even more on being the center of attention, Sophia's indifference was both a challenge and an irritation. Most people in his life responded to him in predictable ways. They either sought to impress him, feared him, or desperately wanted something from him. Sophia, however, seemed immune to his influence. Her demeanor was steady, her gaze calm and unflinching. and her behavior devoid of the usual deference he had come to expect. It was this immunity that gnawed at Ethan. He wasn't used to being ignored, or worse, to being treated as though his wealth and status meant nothing. He began to test her. Small provocations that were subtle enough to seem innocuous but designed to elicit a reaction. One morning, as Sophia was arranging fresh flowers in the dining room, Ethan leaned casually against the doorway. His arms crossed over his chest. "You seem very confident for someone in your position," he remarked. His tone deliberately edged with condescension. Sophia didn't pause or look up from her task. "Confidence makes the work more efficient," she replied evenly. Her voice carried no trace of defensiveness or irritation. Just a simple statement of fact. Ethan frowned slightly. He had expected her to flinch, to offer some sort of justification for her demeanor. Instead, she carried on as though his words had been nothing more than idle commentary. He tried again the next day. As Sophia cleaned the windows in the living room, Ethan sat on the couch, pretending to read while watching her from the corner of his eye. "Do you always take your time like this?" he asked. "I thought professionals were supposed to be more prompt." Sophia turned her head slightly to glance at him. Her expression calm. "Quality takes time, Mr. Walker," she said. Her tone polite but firm. "If you'd prefer speed over thoroughness, I can adjust." Ethan felt his jaw tighten. She hadn't taken the bait. Her response was measured, as always, and it left no room for further critique. She had placed the responsibility squarely back on him without being confrontational. It was a skill he hadn't encountered often, one that left him both impressed and irritated. As the days turned into weeks, Ethan escalated his efforts. His comments becoming sharper, his challenges more deliberate. He wanted to see where her limits were, if she even had any. But no matter what he said or did, Sophia remained unfazed. One afternoon, Ethan decided to push harder. He invited a few business associates to the penthouse for an informal meeting. It wasn't unusual for him to host such gatherings. But this time, his intention wasn't purely professional. He wanted to observe how Sophia handled herself under scrutiny. The associates arrived, loud and boisterous, their presence filling the penthouse with the kind of energy Ethan usually found invigorating. Drinks were poured. Discussions began. And Ethan made sure to call on Sophia frequently, asking for refills or snacks, deliberately interrupting her routine. "Sophia," Ethan called as she passed through the room with a tray. "Do you think we should add some wine to this spread? Or is that too much for someone like you to handle?" The comment was laced with mockery, and a few of his associates chuckled, watching Sophia to see how she would respond. Sophia paused, her gaze steady as she looked at Ethan. "I can manage, Mr. Walker," she said, her voice calm. "Shall I open the Chateau Margaux? Or would you prefer something lighter?" The room fell silent for a moment. Ethan felt a flicker of something he couldn't quite place, respect, perhaps, or frustration. She hadn't risen to his provocation. Instead, she had turned it into a practical question. One that left him looking foolish if he didn't respond. "The Margaux will do," Ethan said finally, his voice colder than he intended. As Sophia left the room, one of his associates leaned closer. "She's an interesting one," the man said with a smirk. "Not the usual type you'd hire." Ethan didn't respond. He found himself watching Sophia's retreating figure, a mix of emotions churning in his chest. She had held her ground once again, and the power dynamic in the room had shifted in her favor, even if only slightly. By the time the evening ended, Ethan felt restless. His usual strategies for asserting dominance had failed, leaving him unsettled in a way he couldn't quite articulate. He was used to being the one in control, the one who dictated the terms of every interaction. But with Sophia, that control slipped through his fingers like sand, no matter how tightly he tried to hold on. Later that night, as the city lights shimmered beyond the glass walls of his penthouse, Ethan sat alone in his study, a glass of bourbon in hand. Sophia's calm, unwavering demeanor replayed in his mind like a puzzle he couldn't solve. She wasn't just resisting him, she was shifting the entire balance of their interactions. And she was doing it without effort. Ethan took a slow sip of his drink, his gaze distant. He realized, with a mix of fascination and frustration, that he wasn't just intrigued by Sophia, he was captivated. She represented something he hadn't encountered in years, a challenge he couldn't predict, a mystery he couldn't unravel. And for a man like Ethan Walker, who thrived on understanding and controlling every aspect of his world, that was both exhilarating and maddening. Ethan Walker was not a man accustomed to losing focus. For years, he had prided himself on his sharp mind, his ability to compartmentalize emotions and stay laser-focused on his goals. His life was a meticulously crafted masterpiece of control, until Sophia Miller walked into it. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly, like a quiet hum in the background of his thoughts. At first, Ethan had dismissed her presence as insignificant, another employee tasked with maintaining the perfection of his surroundings. But the more he observed her, the more she seemed to pull at the threads of his carefully managed world. Sophia's resistance to his authority was unlike anything Ethan had encountered. It wasn't overt rebellion, there were no dramatic confrontations or acts of defiance. Instead, it was her quiet self-assurance. The way she carried herself as though she owed him nothing beyond her work. She followed his instructions with efficiency. But there was no subservience in her manner, no eagerness to please. It was as if she existed entirely separate from the orbit of his wealth and influence. And that infuriated him. At night, as Ethan sat alone in his penthouse, the city's lights twinkling far below, his mind inevitably drifted to Sophia. He replayed their interactions, analyzing every word, every glance, searching for cracks in her armor. What was it about her that made her so impervious to his presence? Why did she seem unaffected by the power that so effortlessly subdued others? Ethan found himself watching her more closely, though he tried to disguise it. He noticed the way she moved with quiet grace, her actions deliberate yet unhurried. He noticed the way her eyes would linger for just a moment on the artwork or the view from the windows, as if she were cataloging the beauty around her but refusing to be impressed by it. And he noticed, most of all, the way she looked at him, not with awe or fear, but with an unnerving calmness that seemed to see through him. One evening, Ethan caught himself standing in the hallway, listening to the faint sounds of Sophia moving about the kitchen. She was humming softly, the melody unfamiliar but soothing. It was such a mundane moment, yet it felt strangely intimate. Ethan shook his head, frustrated with himself. What was he doing? Why was he letting this woman occupy so much of his mental space? But the frustration didn't stop the thoughts. It didn't stop the questions. For a man who thrived on understanding and control, Sophia was an unsolvable equation. And Ethan couldn't stand not having the answers. Who was she? Where had she come from? Why did she seem so utterly indifferent to him when everyone else scrambled to gain his favor? One day, unable to resist the pull any longer, Ethan called his assistant, Lucas, into his office. Look into Sophia Miller, he said. His tone clipped. I want to know everything, where she's from. Her background. Anything unusual. Lucas raised an eyebrow but nodded. He was used to his boss's peculiar requests. Though this one seemed out of character. Ethan rarely concerned himself with the personal lives of his employees. But Lucas knew better than to question him. Hours later. Lucas returned with a file. There's not much. Sir, he said. Handing it over. She's kept a low profile. Grew up in a small town. Worked a few odd jobs before signing on with the agency. Nothing remarkable. Ethan opened the file. Scanning its contents. It was disappointingly sparse, no hidden scandals. No mysterious gaps in her history. If anything. Her life seemed almost too ordinary. As though she had deliberately erased any traces of complexity. The lack of information only deepened Ethan's obsession. He couldn't understand why someone so seemingly unremarkable could command so much of his attention. But Sophia was more than her resume, that much he knew. There was something beneath her calm exterior. Something he couldn't see but could feel. Like the faintest vibration beneath the surface of still water. In the days that followed, Ethan's preoccupation with Sophia grew. He found himself looking for excuses to interact with her. Asking unnecessary questions about mundane tasks just to hear her measured responses. He began to notice things he hadn't before, the way she held her chin slightly higher when she spoke. As if to shield herself from vulnerability, the way her hands moved with quiet confidence. Whether she was adjusting a vase of flowers or polishing the edge of a counter. And yet, no matter how much he observed, Ethan felt no closer to understanding her. If anything, the mystery only deepened. Sophia remained a fortress. Her walls unbreachable. And Ethan found himself wanting, needing, to know what lay behind them. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Ethan approached Sophia while she was arranging books on the shelf in his study. Do you ever stop working? He asked. His tone attempting casualness but betraying the intensity of his curiosity. Sophia turned to face him. Her expression as composed as ever. I prefer to keep busy, she replied simply. Ethan studied her for a moment. His eyes narrowing. You're not like anyone I've ever met. Sophia tilted her head slightly. Her gaze unwavering. Is that a compliment, Mr. Walker? Or an observation? A little of both. Ethan admitted. Surprising himself with his honesty. Sophia didn't smile. But there was a flicker of something in her eyes, amusement. Perhaps. Or recognition. I suppose that makes us even. You're not like anyone I've ever worked for. Ethan leaned against the desk. Crossing his arms. And how am I different? Sophia hesitated. And for the first time, Ethan thought he saw a hint of vulnerability in her expression. It was gone as quickly as it appeared. Replaced by her usual calm demeanor. You seem restless, she said finally. As though you're searching for something. The words struck a chord deep within Ethan. One he wasn't prepared to confront. He straightened. His expression hardening. And you think you figured me out? He asked. His tone sharper than he intended. Sophia met his gaze. Unflinching. No, she said quietly. I think you're still figuring yourself out. Her words hung in the air. Heavy with truth. Ethan didn't reply. He couldn't. For the first time in years. He felt exposed. As though someone had looked past his carefully constructed facade and seen the emptiness beneath. That night, as Ethan lay awake in bed, Sophia's words echoed in his mind. She had touched on something he had spent years ignoring, the gnawing sense of incompleteness that no amount of wealth or success could fill. He turned over. staring at the ceiling. His thoughts a tangled web of frustration, fascination, and something else he couldn't quite name. Sophia Miller was more than a puzzle, she was a mirror. Reflecting back parts of himself he wasn't ready to see. And Ethan Walker, for the first time in his life, didn't know what to do. Ethan Walker sat in the vast, dimly lit living room of his penthouse. The only sound the rhythmic tapping of rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows. A glass of bourbon sat untouched on the table beside him. The city stretched out below, its lights flickering like a galaxy of stars. But tonight, they offered him no solace. His thoughts were consumed by Sophia Miller. She was more than just a housekeeper now. She was a presence. A force that had infiltrated every corner of his meticulously controlled life. Over the weeks, she had challenged him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Not through direct confrontation but through her unwavering calm. Her quiet defiance. Her presence unsettled him. Yet he couldn't pull away. He was drawn to her like a moth to a flame. Even as he felt the burn of her resistance. Sophia entered the room silently. Her steps as deliberate as always. She carried a tray with 2 steaming mugs of tea. Placing it on the coffee table with practiced precision. Ethan watched her. His gaze sharp. Searching for something he couldn't define. "You've been avoiding me," he said suddenly. Breaking the silence. Sophia straightened. Her expression as composed as ever. "I've been doing my job. Mr. Walker. Don't give me that." Ethan snapped. His voice sharper than he intended. "You've been distant." Sophia met his gaze. Her deep brown eyes steady and unflinching. "You've been watching me too closely," she replied evenly. "Perhaps that's why it feels that way." The comment caught him off guard. Ethan leaned back in his chair. A bitter laugh escaping his lips. "You're bold. I'll give you that. I only speak the truth," Sophia said. Her tone measured. She sat in the armchair across from him. Her posture as poised as ever. "But the truth isn't something you like to hear. Is it?" Ethan narrowed his eyes. "What are you trying to say?" Sophia hesitated for a moment. As though weighing her words. When she spoke, her voice was softer but carried a weight that cut through the tension in the room. "Do you ever feel free, Ethan?" she asked. "Or are you just a prisoner of your own power?" The question hung in the air like a thunderclap. Ethan felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted. The foundation of his carefully constructed life suddenly unstable. He opened his mouth to respond. But no words came. He couldn't deny the truth in her question. And that truth hit him like a blow. "What are you talking about?" he said finally. His voice quieter now. Almost defensive. Sophia leaned forward slightly. Her gaze piercing. "You live in this tower. Surrounded by wealth and luxury. Controlling everything and everyone around you. But what do you have, Ethan? What do you truly have that matters?" "I have everything." Ethan shot back. His voice rising. "More than most people could ever dream of." Sophia didn't flinch. "Do you?" she asked softly. "Because all I see is a man who's trapped. Trapped by the things he thinks define him. The money. The power. The control, they're just walls. Ethan. And you're the one who built them." Ethan stood abruptly. Pacing to the window. He couldn't face her. Couldn't face the weight of her words. The rain streaked down the glass, obscuring the view of the city below. And for the first time, Ethan felt as though he were drowning. "You don't know anything about me," he said. His voice low and strained. "You don't know what it took to get here. Sophia stood as well. Her movements calm and deliberate. "You're right," she said. "I don't know the details of your life. But I know what it looks like to be empty. And that's what you are. Ethan." "Empty." Ethan turned to face her. His chest tight with a mix of anger and something else he couldn't name. "What gives you the right to say that?" he demanded. "You think you're better than me? Smarter than me?" Sophia shook her head. Her expression unreadable. "No," she said simply. "I'm just not afraid to see the truth." Her words hit Ethan like a tidal wave. He felt exposed. As though she had peeled back the layers he had spent years constructing and seen the hollow core beneath. He wanted to argue. To fight back. But he couldn't. Because deep down, he knew she was right. He sank back into the chair. His head in his hands. For a long moment. The room was silent except for the rain. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. Almost broken. "I don't know how to stop," he admitted. "The control. The power, it's all I've ever known. It's what got me here. If I let go of that, what's left?" Sophia walked over and knelt in front of him. Her calm demeanor softening just slightly. "You're the one who gets to decide that," she said gently. "Control isn't what defines you, Ethan. What defines you is what you do when you let go of it." Ethan looked at her. His eyes filled with a vulnerability he hadn't shown in years. "And what if there's nothing left?" he asked. His voice barely a whisper. Sophia's gaze didn't waver. "There's always something," she said. "But you have to be brave enough to look for it." Her words settled over him like a balm. Soothing but painful in their truth. Ethan didn't know if he was ready to face what lay on the other side of control. But for the first time, he felt the faintest flicker of hope that there might be something more. As Sophia rose and left the room, Ethan remained where he was, staring out at the rain-soaked city. Her words echoed in his mind. Each one carving away at the walls he had built around himself. He had spent his life chasing power, believing it would bring him freedom. But now, for the first time, he began to wonder if it had only ever been a cage. Ethan Walker sat in his study. The weight of Sophia's words still pressing heavily on his mind. The city stretched out before him through the penthouse windows. Its glittering lights and towering skyscrapers a reflection of the life he had built. It was a life that should have felt fulfilling. But now, it felt more like a gilded cage. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass absent-mindedly, trying to drown out the echo of her voice, "You're the one who gets to decide." The sound of soft footsteps drew his attention. He turned to see Sophia standing in the doorway. Her calm presence filling the room like an unspoken challenge. She carried nothing. But her gaze held the weight of someone about to deliver something profound. "I need to speak with you," she said. Her tone as measured as ever. Ethan gestured for her to enter. Curious despite himself, he leaned back in his chair, attempting to regain a semblance of control. "You seem to be full of opinions lately," he said. His voice laced with both irritation and intrigue. "What is it this time?" Sophia stepped further into the room but didn't sit. Instead, she stood a few feet away. Her posture as poised as always. "This isn't about opinions, Mr. Walker," she said. "It's about choices." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Choices?" She nodded. "You've spent your entire life building walls made of wealth, power, and control. But those walls haven't brought you freedom. They've trapped you. And I believe you know that." He scoffed, though the sound lacked conviction. "And what do you suggest I do? Tear them down? Leave everything behind?" Is that your solution? Sophia's expression remained calm. Unyielding. Yes, she said simply. That's exactly what I'm suggesting. Ethan froze. Caught off guard by the directness of her response. He had expected her to dance around the subject. To offer vague philosophical musings. But Sophia, as always, was straightforward. You can't find freedom in the life you've created, she continued. It's built on foundations that no longer serve you. If you want something deeper, something real, you have to be willing to let go of everything that holds you back. And what does that mean? Ethan asked. His voice quieter now. Tinged with unease. Letting go of what? My money? My company? My name? Yes. Sophia said without hesitation. All of it. Your wealth. Your status. This carefully curated identity you've built, their chains. Ethan. And until you're willing to break free from them, you'll never know what true freedom feels like. Her words struck him like a blow. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the city outside. Ethan stared at her. His mind racing. The idea was absurd. Unthinkable. Everything he had built, everything he had sacrificed for, was tied to his wealth and power. Without them, who was he? I can't just walk away from everything, he said finally. His voice filled with frustration. That's not how the world works. It's how your world could work. Sophia replied. If you choose it. Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. Why are you doing this? He asked. His tone both curious and accusatory. Why do you care what happens to me? Sophia's gaze softened slightly, though her composure remained intact. Because I've been where you are, she said. I've lived in a world where everything felt hollow. Where the pursuit of more was the only thing driving me. And I know what it's like to feel trapped by it. Ethan frowned. This was the first time she had revealed anything about herself. And the admission only deepened the mystery surrounding her. And you found a way out? He asked. I did. Sophia said. But it required sacrifice. The kind of sacrifice most people aren't willing to make. And you think I am? Ethan asked. A bitter edge to his voice. Sophia tilted her head slightly, studying him. I think you're at a crossroads, she said. You can continue down the path you're on, chasing control and feeling emptier with every step. Or you can take a leap into the unknown and find something real. Ethan sat back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. The tension in the room was palpable. The weight of her proposition pressing down on him like a physical force. Part of him wanted to dismiss her, to call her idealistic and naive. But another part of him, the part he had been trying to ignore for years, knew she was right. What happens if I say yes? He asked. His voice quieter now. Sophia stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. If you say yes, you'll leave this life behind. The money, the company, the penthouse, it all goes. You'll start over. With nothing but yourself. It won't be easy. And it won't be comfortable. But it will be real. Ethan felt his chest tighten. The idea was terrifying. He had spent his entire life defining himself by what he owned. By what he controlled. Letting go of that felt like stepping off the edge of a cliff. And if I say no? He asked. Sophia's expression didn't change. Then nothing changes. You stay here. In this life. With all its comforts and all its emptiness. The choice is yours. Ethan stared at her. His mind a whirlwind of fear. Anger. And curiosity. He wanted to argue. To demand why she had the audacity to offer such a proposition. But deep down, he knew she wasn't forcing him into anything. The choice truly was his. He stood, pacing to the window. The rain had stopped. And the city below was bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. He thought about everything he had built. Everything he had sacrificed to get here. And he thought about how little it all meant now. Finally, he turned to face her. "If I do this," he said. His voice steady but uncertain. "What's left of me?" Sophia stepped closer. Her expression gentle but resolute. "Only what matters," she said. "And that's more than you think." Ethan took a deep breath. The weight of the decision pressing down on him. Fear clawed at the edges of his mind. But so did a flicker of hope, a hope he hadn't felt in years. "Okay," he said finally. His voice barely more than a whisper. "I'll do it." Sophia nodded. A small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Good," she said. "Then we begin." The room was dark. Illuminated only by the faint glow of a single candle on the table between them. Sophia stood on the other side of the room. Her calm presence as steady as ever. Ethan Walker hesitated. Staring at the door she had unlocked moments before. It wasn't an ordinary door, it seemed almost otherworldly. Shimmering faintly. As though it pulsed with energy. What lay beyond it was a mystery. One Sophia had promised would change everything. "This is your first step," Sophia said. Her voice steady but carrying an edge of warning. "What's on the other side will reflect everything you've hidden from yourself. It won't be easy. But it's necessary." Ethan clenched his fists. His heart pounding. He was no stranger to challenges, his entire life had been a series of battles for power and control. But this was different. This wasn't about acquiring something external. It was about confronting something internal. Something he wasn't sure he was ready to face. "Why can't you just tell me what's in there?" he asked. His voice betraying his unease. "Because it's different for everyone," Sophia replied. "What you'll see. What you'll feel, it's yours alone. I can't guide you through it. You have to face it yourself." Ethan swallowed hard. His throat dry. He glanced back at the shimmering door. Its faint hum filling the silence in the room. Finally, he nodded. Stepping forward. With a deep breath. He placed his hand on the door's surface. Feeling an unexpected warmth beneath his palm. The door swung open soundlessly. And a blinding light engulfed him. When the light faded, Ethan found himself standing in a vast, empty field. The sky above was a swirling mix of colors, blues, purples, and golds, that seemed alive. Shifting and changing with every breath he took. The air was heavy. Almost oppressive. And the silence was deafening. In the distance, he saw a figure, a younger version of himself. Dressed in a suit that was almost identical to the ones he wore now. The younger Ethan was pacing. His movements frantic. His face twisted in frustration. Ethan hesitated. Then walked closer. Each step feeling heavier than the last. "You think this is enough?" the younger Ethan spat. His voice sharp and accusatory. "All the deals. The money. The accolades, they don't mean anything." Ethan froze. His chest tightening. He remembered this moment vividly. It had been a decade ago. After one of his company's most successful acquisitions. He should have been celebrating. But instead, he had spent the night alone in his office. Staring at the contracts and feeling an inexplicable emptiness. "I did what I had to do," Ethan said. His voice defensive. "It got us here. didn't it? The younger version of himself turned. His eyes blazing with anger. And where is here, he demanded. Alone in a penthouse? With no one to share it with? Tell me. Ethan, was it worth it? The words hit like a punch to the gut. Ethan wanted to argue. To justify his choices. But he couldn't. Deep down. He knew the answer. The younger Ethan dissolved into mist. Leaving Ethan alone once more. He looked around. The oppressive silence closing in again. Suddenly. Another figure emerged from the haze, this time. It was his father. Underscore 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 underscore. His father stood tall. His expression stern. Just as Ethan remembered him. A man of rigid discipline. His father had always demanded perfection. He had instilled in Ethan the belief that success was the only measure of a man's worth. You're not good enough, his father said. His voice cold and cutting. No matter how much you achieve. It will never be enough. Ethan's fists clenched. He had spent his entire life proving his father wrong. Building an empire to silence that voice. But no matter how high he climbed. Those words had always lingered. Like a shadow he couldn't escape. Stop. Ethan said. His voice shaking. You're wrong. His father's figure loomed closer. His presence overwhelming. Am I? Then why are you still chasing? Why do you still hear my voice every time you fail? The question cut deep. Forcing Ethan to confront the truth. He had built his empire out of defiance. But in doing so, he had allowed his father's judgment to control him. It wasn't freedom. It was another kind of prison. I'm done letting you control me. Ethan said finally. His voice steadier now. You don't define me anymore. The figure of his father wavered. Then dissolved into the mist like the younger Ethan before him. The silence returned. But this time. It felt lighter, less oppressive. Ethan took a deep breath. Feeling a faint sense of relief. Underscore 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 underscore. As he moved forward, the scenery shifted. The field gave way to a long, dark corridor lined with mirrors. Each mirror reflected a different version of himself, some triumphant, others broken, and some that seemed almost unrecognizable. He paused in front of one mirror, where his reflection showed a man surrounded by stacks of money and lavish trophies, yet with hollow eyes. Is this who I am? Ethan asked aloud. His voice echoing in the corridor. The reflection didn't answer. But its hollow stare spoke volumes. Ethan reached out. Touching the glass. It shattered instantly. The shards falling at his feet. Behind the mirror was a path. Illuminated by a faint golden light. He stepped through. The light growing brighter with each step. It led him to a small, quiet room where Sophia was waiting. Seated on a simple wooden chair. The calm she exuded was a stark contrast to the chaos he had just experienced. Welcome back, she said softly. Ethan stared at her. His chest rising and falling as he struggled to process what he had just endured. What was that? He asked. His voice raw. That was you. Sophia replied. The pieces of yourself you've tried to bury. The fears. The regrets. The voices that have shaped your choices. You had to face them to move forward. Ethan sank into a chair opposite her. His body heavy with exhaustion. And now, he asked. What's left of me? Sophia leaned forward. Her gaze steady and reassuring. Now. You begin again, she said. Not as the man defined by his past. But as someone who chooses what matters. Ethan closed his eyes. Her words settling over him like a bomb. For the first time in years. He felt a flicker of something he hadn't thought possible, peace. He didn't know what lay ahead. But he knew he was ready to find out. Ethan Walker sat alone on the edge of a cliff overlooking a serene lake. The water reflecting the warm hues of the setting sun. The space felt almost surreal. As though it existed outside of time and reality. It was quiet here, deceptively so. In the silence. He could hear the echoes of his own thoughts. The weight of them pressing against his chest like a vice. He had been walking this metaphorical journey for what felt like an eternity. Peeling back the layers of his life one by one. The pursuit of power. The endless acquisitions. The facade of control, he could now see it all for what it truly was, a prison. Every choice he had made to fortify his empire had only tightened the chains around his soul. He was a prisoner of his own making. And for the first time, he understood the depth of his captivity. Behind him, Sophia approached quietly. Her footsteps soft against the rocky ground. She stopped a few feet away. Watching him in silence. For all her calm composure. There was an intensity in her gaze. As though she could see the battle raging within him. You've been quiet, she said after a moment. Her voice gentle but firm. What's on your mind? Ethan didn't look at her. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon. His thoughts churning like the rippling water below. Everything, he said finally. His voice heavy with exhaustion. Everything I've done. Everything I thought I wanted, it's all meaningless. Sophia stepped closer. Sitting on a nearby rock. Tell me, she said simply. Her tone inviting rather than probing. Ethan let out a bitter laugh. Where do I start? I spent my whole life chasing power. Building an empire. Proving to everyone, and to myself, that I was worth something. And now I realize I've been running in circles. The money. The control. The success, it's all just noise. None of it matters. Sophia studied him for a moment. Her expression thoughtful. Why do you think you did it? She asked. What were you trying to prove? Ethan hesitated. The question hanging in the air. He wanted to deny it. To brush it off as ambition or necessity. But he knew that wouldn't be the truth. Slowly. He shook his head. I guess. I was trying to prove I wasn't weak. That I wasn't my father's failure. Or the scared kid who grew up in his shadow. But all I did was turn into him, a man obsessed with control. Incapable of seeing beyond his own fears. Sophia nodded. Her gaze steady. That's a hard truth to face, she said. But it's the first step toward freedom. Ethan finally looked at her. His eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and vulnerability. What does freedom even mean? He asked. Because right now. It just feels like losing everything I've built. Freedom isn't about losing. Sophia replied. It's about letting go. Letting go of the things that don't serve you. The things that keep you chained to a life that isn't truly yours. It's about choosing what matters and accepting who you are, flaws and all. Her words hit him like a wave. Both comforting and challenging. Ethan turned back to the lake. His mind racing. He had spent years hiding behind his accomplishments, using them as shields against his own insecurities. But now, with nothing left to hide behind, he felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't allowed himself to be in decades. "And what about you?" he asked suddenly, turning back to Sophia. "You talk about letting go like it's easy. But I don't believe it's that simple. You've been through this, haven't you? What did you have to let go of?" Sophia's expression softened, a flicker of pain crossing her face. For a moment, she looked almost fragile, as though the weight of her own past threatened to overwhelm her. But then she took a deep breath, her composure returning. "I grew up in a world that was all about survival," she began. "We didn't have much, barely enough to get by most of the time. I thought if I worked hard enough, if I made myself indispensable, I could escape it. So I worked. I worked until I couldn't feel anything but exhaustion. And when I finally had a chance to leave that life behind, I realized I had built a new prison for myself, one made of fear and guilt." Ethan listened intently, the raw honesty in her voice cutting through the fog of his own thoughts. "What happened?" he asked quietly. "I let it go," Sophia said simply. "It wasn't easy. I had to confront every fear, every regret, every lie I told myself about who I was and what I deserved. But when I did, I found something I never thought possible: peace. And that's what I want for you, Ethan. Not perfection. Not control. Just peace." Ethan looked at her, the walls he had built around his emotions beginning to crumble. "How do you do it?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "How do you face it all and not fall apart?" Sophia smiled faintly, a mixture of warmth and sadness in her expression. "You don't avoid falling apart," she said. "You let it happen. You let yourself break. And then you rebuild. Stronger. Freer. And more honest than before." Ethan closed his eyes, her words settling over him like a bomb. For so long, he had resisted the idea of breaking, believing it to be a sign of weakness. But now, he realized it was the only way forward. To rebuild, he had to first let go of the ruins of what no longer served him. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the lake in shades of gold and orange, Ethan felt a strange sense of clarity. He wasn't free yet. But for the first time, he could see the path ahead, a path that didn't require him to be anyone but himself. "I don't know if I can do it," he admitted, his voice trembling with emotion. "But I want to try." Sophia reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "That's all that matters," she said gently. "The rest will come. Together." They sat in silence, the lake reflecting the beginnings of a new chapter. For Ethan, the journey wasn't over, it was just beginning. But he no longer felt alone. He no longer felt trapped. And for the first time in years, he felt the faintest glimmer of hope. The dawn light filtered through the tall trees, casting golden rays over the small, secluded cabin where Ethan Walker now lived. It was a stark contrast to the gleaming penthouse he had once called home. The cabin, nestled in a forest clearing, was simple: wooden floors, modest furniture, and the faint scent of pine lingering in the air. Yet, for the first time in his life, Ethan felt like he belonged. Months had passed since he had walked through the metaphorical door that Sophia had opened for him. The journey had been grueling, forcing him to confront truths about himself he had long avoided. He had relinquished his wealth, his corporate empire, and the carefully curated persona that had shielded him from vulnerability. In their place, He had found something he had never expected: peace. Ethan stood on the porch, a mug of coffee warming his hands as he watched the sun rise over the treetops. The stillness of the moment filled him with a quiet joy he could barely describe. He no longer felt the constant need to prove himself, to chase success for the sake of validation. For the first time, he was content with simply being. The sound of footsteps on the path behind him broke his reverie. He turned to see Sophia approaching, her silhouette framed by the morning light. She carried a basket of fresh produce from the garden they had started together, her calm demeanor as steady as ever. Over the months, she had become more than a guide, she was a partner. An equal in this new life they were building. "You're up early," she said with a faint smile, setting the basket down on the porch railing. "I like the mornings here," Ethan replied, his voice quieter than it used to be, softened by the simplicity of his new life. "They feel honest." Sophia nodded, leaning against the railing. "Honest is a good word for it. No pretense. No distractions. Just the world as it is." Ethan glanced at her, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. "I didn't think I could ever feel this way," he admitted. "Like I'm not constantly chasing something. It's freeing." "That's because you've stopped running," Sophia said gently. "You've let go of the things that were holding you back." He nodded, her words resonating deeply. Letting go had been the hardest thing he'd ever done, letting go of his wealth, his status, the identity he had spent a lifetime building. But in doing so, he had discovered something far more valuable: himself. Underscore 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 underscore. The days that followed were filled with a quiet rhythm Ethan had come to cherish. He spent his mornings tending to the garden, his afternoons repairing the cabin or walking through the forest, and his evenings sharing simple meals with Sophia by the fireplace. It was a life stripped of the excesses he had once clung to. But it was richer than anything he had ever known. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Sophia spoke about her own journey. It was rare for her to share much about her past. But in the intimacy of the moment, she opened up. "I used to think freedom was about control," she said, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames. "Controlling my circumstances. Controlling how people saw me. Controlling every decision. But it wasn't freedom, it was fear. Fear of failure. Fear of being vulnerable." Ethan listened intently, her words mirroring his own struggles. "What changed for you?" he asked. "I realized that control wasn't the answer," Sophia said. "It was letting go. Accepting that I couldn't control everything. That life wasn't about perfection. It was about presence, being here. Now. And embracing it for what it is." Her words stayed with Ethan long after the fire had died down. He had spent so much of his life trying to control every aspect of it, believing that control was the key to happiness. But Sophia was right, happiness wasn't something you controlled. It was something you allowed. Underscore 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 underscore. Over time, Ethan began to reconnect with parts of himself he had long ignored. He rediscovered the joy of creating. spending hours carving intricate designs into pieces of wood he found in the forest. He wrote in a journal Sophia had given him, pouring out thoughts and emotions he had never dared to face before. And he found fulfillment in the simplicity of everyday tasks, things he had once dismissed as mundane but now saw as opportunities to connect with the world around him. Sophia was always there, guiding him when he needed it but never pushing. She understood that this was his journey, just as hers had been her own. They worked side by side in the garden, cooked meals together, and shared conversations that delved deeper than Ethan had ever thought possible. She challenged him, supported him, and, most importantly, showed him that he wasn't alone. One afternoon, as they sat beneath the shade of a tree, Ethan turned to her with a question that had been on his mind for weeks. "Why did you help me?" he asked. "Why did you stay?" Sophia looked at him, her gaze steady and filled with a quiet strength. "Because I saw myself in you," she said. "And I knew what it felt like to be trapped. To think there was no way out. I wanted you to see that there is always a way, if you're willing to take it." Ethan nodded, her words sinking deep into his heart. He had taken the leap she had offered him. And while it had been terrifying, it had also been the most liberating experience of his life. Underscore 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 underscore. The transformation wasn't instant. Nor was it without setbacks. There were days when Ethan doubted himself, when the old voices of insecurity and fear crept back into his mind. But each time, he reminded himself of what he had learned, that he didn't have to be perfect, that he didn't have to control everything, and that the only thing that truly mattered was the life he was living now. One evening, as the sun set over the forest, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Ethan stood with Sophia on the porch. They watched the light fade into twilight, the quiet hum of the world around them a comforting presence. "This is enough," Ethan said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "I thought I needed more success, more power, more everything. But this is enough." Sophia smiled. A soft, knowing smile that spoke of her own journey to this understanding. "It always was," she said. "You just had to see it." Ethan reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining. For the first time in years, he felt truly alive, not because of what he owned, but because of who he was becoming. Together, they stood in the fading light, not as savior and seeker, but as equals, partners in a life defined by simplicity, authenticity, and purpose. And for Ethan Walker, rebirth had never felt so real. The evening was quiet, the forest blanketed in hues of twilight as the last traces of the sun dipped below the horizon. Ethan Walker stood on the porch of the cabin, gazing out at the vast expanse of the natural world before him. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the faint whisper of a breeze that rustled through the trees. Beside him, Sophia Miller stood silently, her presence steady and grounding. For weeks, the cabin had been a sanctuary, a place where Ethan had begun to rebuild himself, not as the man defined by power and wealth, but as someone learning to live authentically. Here, amid the simplicity of nature, he had faced the truths he once feared. Now, as he stood shoulder to shoulder with Sophia, the weight of his past felt lighter, as though it no longer had the power to control him. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Sophia said, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, almost reverent, as though she were speaking not just about the horizon but about something far greater. Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains bathed in the orange and purple glow of the setting sun. It is, he replied. I don't think I ever noticed beauty like this before. I was always too busy chasing something, or running from something. Sophia turned to look at him, her expression thoughtful. And now? Ethan exhaled, his breath visible in the cool evening air. Now. I don't feel the need to chase or run. For the first time. I feel, still. Like I can just be. Sophia smiled faintly, a look of quiet satisfaction crossing her face. That's what freedom feels like, she said. It's not about escaping or controlling. It's about finding peace in the present. Ethan glanced at her, the gratitude he felt for her guidance evident in his eyes. I didn't think I'd ever feel this way, he admitted. I thought freedom was about having everything. Now I see it's about needing nothing. They stood in silence for a while, the tranquility of the forest enveloping them. The horizon stretched endlessly before them, the fading light casting long shadows across the land. It felt symbolic, this moment of stillness after so much turmoil. This space where the future felt open and unburdened by the weight of the past. Underscore 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 underscore. Ethan's journey hadn't been easy. The man who once controlled empires, who dictated terms and wielded power like a weapon, had been stripped down to his essence. He had faced the ghosts of his past, the expectations of his father, the hollow victories of his career, the lies he had told himself about what mattered. And in letting go of those things, he had found something far more valuable, himself. But the journey wasn't over. It never truly was. Freedom, he realized, wasn't a destination. It was a practice. A daily choice to live with intention and authenticity. There would still be challenges. Still be moments of doubt and fear. But now, he felt equipped to face them, not with the armor of control, but with the strength of acceptance. Sophia had played an integral role in that transformation. She had been both a mirror and a guide, showing him parts of himself he had long ignored. Yet, she never demanded anything of him. She simply stood by his side, unwavering, allowing him to find his own way. Do you ever think about the future? Ethan asked, breaking the silence. Sophia turned her gaze to the horizon. All the time, she said. But not in the way I used to. I don't plan it out or try to control it anymore. I just think about the possibilities. The unknown used to scare me. But now, I find it exciting. Ethan smiled, her words resonating deeply. The unknown, he repeated. It's terrifying and exhilarating all at once. That's what makes it worth it. Sophia said. When you let go of control, you open yourself to experiences you never imagined. That's where life happens. Ethan nodded, his mind wandering to the life he had left behind. The towering skyscrapers, the boardroom battles, the endless pursuit of more, they felt like a distant memory. Almost like another lifetime. He didn't miss it. Instead, he felt a quiet gratitude for the lessons it had taught him. Even as he walked away from it all. Underscore 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 underscore. As the sky darkened, stars began to emerge. One by one. Until the night was blanketed in their brilliance. Ethan and Sophia remained on the porch. The silence between them comfortable and unspoken. It was a silence filled with understanding. The kind that didn't need to be filled with words. What now? Ethan asked eventually. His voice contemplative. Sophia glanced at him. Her lips curving into a faint smile. Now. We live, she said simply. We don't need to have all the answers. We just need to take each day as it comes. Ethan considered her words. The simplicity of them resonating deeply. He had spent so much of his life chasing certainty. Planning every step. Calculating every move. But now. The idea of embracing the unknown felt liberating. Do you think it'll be enough? He asked quietly. His gaze returning to the stars. Sophia reached out. Placing a hand on his arm. It already is, she said. You just have to believe it. Ethan turned to look at her. The sincerity in her words anchoring him. For the first time. He felt a sense of hope, not the kind that came from external achievements. But the kind that came from within. Together. They stood beneath the starlit sky. The forest around them alive with the soft sounds of the night. The horizon stretched endlessly before them. A symbol of the open-ended future that awaited. There were no guarantees. No clear paths. But there was something far more valuable, the freedom to create a life on their own terms. Ethan took a deep breath. The cool night air filling his lungs. I'm ready, he said. His voice steady. Sophia smiled. Her eyes reflecting the same quiet determination. Then let's see where this journey takes us. As the night deepened. They remained there. Standing side by side. Gazing at the tranquil horizon. It wasn't an ending. Nor was it a beginning. It was simply a moment, a promise of the life they would build. A life free from the chains of the past and open to the infinite possibilities of the future. And in that moment, Ethan Walker finally understood what it meant to be free.